So, as ever, I'm looking for a couple of volunteers. I'd be grateful if somebody could read chapter 23, and then somebody could read 25, 1 to 11, just the first 11 verses. And as they say, a volunteer is usually better than a conscript. So if you had a volunteer, that'd be brilliant.
I'd read 25.
I can do one, John.
Okay.
One of them.
Gavin's going to do 25, 1 to 11, I think. Gillian, could you do 23 then, please?
Yep.
Thank you. So 23.
So I'll start now?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yep.
Have you seen it yet, Gavin?
Okay. Genesis 23. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went into mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my lord, you are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land. And he said to them, If you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat for me Ephron the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place. Now Ephron was sitting among the Hittites, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites, of all who went in at the gate of his city, No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the sight of the sons of my people I give it to you. Bury your dead. Then Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron, in the hearing of the people of the land, But if you will hear me, I give the price of the field. Accept it from me, that I may bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham, My lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weight current among the merchants. So the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field throughout its whole area, were made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites, before all who went in at the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place by the Hittites.
Thank you, Gillian.
Again, Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah. And she bore him Zimram, and Josham, and Medan, and Midian, and Eshabak, and Shuraf, and Josham begot Sheba, and Dedam, and the sons of Dedam were Asherim, and Letasham, and and Min, and the sons of Midian, Ephraim and Ephraim, and Hanok and Abidai, and Eldashah, and these were the children of Keturah. And Abraham gave all that he had unto Isaac, and unto the sons of the concubines which Abraham had Abraham gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son, while he yet lived eastward unto the east country. And these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, which he lived 160 years. Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, and an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. And his son Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave at Machpelah in the field of Ephron, and the sons of Zoar the Hittite, which is before Mirah. The field of Abraham purchased of the sons of Hereth. There was Abraham buried, and Sarah his wife. And it came to pass after the death of Abraham, the God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac dwelt by the way, by the well, Leharoth Roah.
Thank you, Gavin. As he was saying, Court, you're relieved from all reading duty for the next 6 months. That's a tough lot of names there. I appreciate that. Thank you. Friends, as usual, what we're going to do is this is meant to be a sort of interactive Bible study. It's not meant to be a sermon as such. So I just want to take you through the storyline, bring out what I think are the important bits and some interesting bits, maybe, may not be quite so important. Maybe pinpoint 1 or 2 points of application, and then we can maybe talk about some of those points. But as I'm always trying to do, let me just give you the storyline here in terms of its chronology and geography. And we're taking these two stories together this evening because obviously complement each other with the account of Sarah's death and then Abraham's death a number of years later, and the lessons that we learned from that. And then next week, God willing, in our final study in this series, we'll go back to 24, which is a huge chapter, the biggest chapter in Genesis by some distance, and the really important story of Abraham's search for a wife for Isaac. So where we are at the moment, here's our timeline. And last week, remember, or 2 weeks ago, I think it was now, we're with Genesis 22 with the potential sacrifice of Isaac on Mount Moriah, which took place here, 2046 BC. And here is where we are now. So we're 17 years later with the death of Sarah in Genesis 23 at the age of 137. And 3 years after that, Isaac marries, which we'll pick up next week, of course. And then Abraham marries again 5 years after, 5 years after the death of Sarah. And we saw that in chapter 25. And then he himself dies here in Genesis 25 at the age of 175, according to biblical record. So that's where we are in the timeline at this moment in time. So when Sarah dies, I'm just trying to do my sums here very quickly. It's about 38 years before Abraham. He still lives for another 28, 30 years after Sarah's death. And just in terms of where we are on the map, for the last period of Genesis, we've been looking at Abraham is based in, sorry, why is this not coming up here? Abraham has actually been based in Beersheba down here. He spent some time among the Philistines, then he settled down in Beersheba. But now as we pick it up in 23, it would appear that they've settled back up here in Hebron, because that's where Sarah dies, we're told at the beginning of chapter 23. And there's different names here given to the same place. Moses makes an interesting editorial comment in 23 verse 19. Remember, Moses is writing many years after the event to people who won't know these original names, so he has to locate them in the place they're familiar with. So in verse 19, he says, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So Machpelah and Mamre and Hebron and Kiriath Arba are almost synonymous. There may be tiny little hamlets, if you like, or different fields and dwellings. But by the time the people of Moses' day are reading this, it's Hebron. And so everything in this chapter takes place in this little section here, in what we are familiar with as the name of Hebron. So I'm just going to kill the PowerPoint so I can see your faces, etc. And let's just look at the story. And again, I don't know how familiar you are with this particular part of the story. What's interesting to me as I was reading this again, in chapter 23, notice how often the term bury comes in here. So Abraham wants a burying place that he can bury his dead. And that phrase, bury your dead or bury my dead, comes about 7 times in chapter 23. So if we're in any doubt as to the main focus of this chapter, it's about someone's death. And of course, it's Sarah's death. And she and Abraham appear to have once again been living at Hebron, as I say. But her death in Canaan is another stage in the process, as was hers and Abraham's arrival in Canaan many years before, of God giving them and their descendants the land itself. And her long life, with its rejuvenated qualities in old age, are a testimony to God's blessing on her, and her significance is reflected in the fact. And here's one of those, maybe you want to say trivial moments that you want to just store away for use in a quiz somewhere. One of the things unique about Sarah is she is the only woman in the whole of Scripture that I can find anyway. I may be missing something, but I don't think so, where her age at death is recorded. That's, you may think big deal, but that's really unusual for a woman in biblical records to have her age of death recorded. Again, marks Sarah out as a remarkable and important woman in God's purposes. We're thinking about another remarkable and important woman in God's purposes this morning. Here at the other end of the age scale, we have Sarah. And again, we shouldn't make too little of Sarah. She is really quite remarkable. She is quoted at least, and there may be more, but at least, I think, 4 times in the New Testament. I want you to just look at a couple of those references with me, because this is a reminder to us of how important she is. In Hebrews chapter 11, that great chapter of the heroes and the heroines of the faith. This is what we read in Hebrews 11, verse 11. 8 to 10 is all about Abraham, although Sarah is there by implication, but Sarah gets her own mention, verse 11. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith. That includes Sarah. Verse 13 rounds up all the people mentioned in the first 12 verses. Sarah died in faith. She died faithful. She died not having yet seen the promises made to her and Abraham about the land. There were promises to her as well as to Abraham. And she died in faith. She persevered to the end. But also in 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter goes to Sarah as an example of women behaving in a godly way. Let me just read from verse 5 of 1 Peter 3. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God, that's another phrase for faith actually, who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. In fact, that question, even as I'm reading that, something that strikes me here. We're told in the New Testament, Jesus talks about, you are the children of Abraham if you obey like Abraham obeyed. And now Peter is saying to the ladies in the church, you are the daughters of Sarah if you live like Sarah lived. So she's being held up in an almost unique way among women in the scriptures as a great example of faith and obedience to God. So in Genesis 23, of course, this amazing lady dies. She's been there a little bit in the background of Abraham's life, but nonetheless, she's been faithfully alongside him in their walk of faith before God. And of course, we're told in verse 2 that Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And again, I think I'm right in saying here, this is the first time in the scriptures we have a mention of tears or somebody weeping in this particular way. And it's quite natural that after being married for so many decades, Abraham weeps and mourns for the loss of his wife. Now I say for the loss of his wife, but of course you can't lose something when you know where it is. And he has no doubt where Sarah is because she's died in faith. We had a friend in south of England many years ago, very good friends, and he and his second wife were our friends, and his first wife had died before we got to know them. And I remember him telling us a story that soon after his first wife had died, he was in some church meeting. He was a pastor, and with their little boys, and I think if I remember rightly, they were in a queue for some food at a buffet or something. And one of the other people in the meeting, trying to be kind and thoughtful, said to Peter, the father, was so sorry about your loss. And Peter's little son said something along the lines of, why do they think mummy's lost? We know exactly where she is. That's a great testimony from a young child, isn't it? So it's not wrong to grieve for a believer. It's not wrong to grieve for anybody who dies. But it's not wrong to grieve for a Christian, a believer who dies, because the scriptures say we grieve, but not as those who have no hope. And so Abraham grieves, but he knows that Sarah has died in faith. And we don't know how much they understood, but I have no doubt, as we'll see just in a moment, that the people of Abraham's day, and therefore Abraham himself in his unique at that time walk with God, they had some understanding that there was a life beyond this life. How exactly what that looked like, we can't be sure. We're not told specifically. But he had some understanding there was a life to come and that Sarah had not died and passed into nothingness, if you like. Because you and I, as New Testament believers, have so much more understanding of that. Absent from the body, present with the Lord, etc. But now what becomes clear, this is a really important part of the whole story of Abraham, is that although they've been living in Canaan for quite a number of years now, probably about 60 years by my calculation, and despite owning it all by faith, if you like, because God had made the promise to Abraham, wherever you put the sole of your foot, that belongs to you. Abraham does not yet legally, in the eyes of the world, own a piece of land. So he can't go to, Ephron the Hittite, and say, listen, pal, I want to bury my wife in a cave on your ground, and God's already given me your ground, so I'm just going to appropriate it. That would not be a good way to carry out his witness. So he goes to buy the land. There's a really interesting little scenario here of them going through this transaction. He goes to where the people are gathered together, probably at the gate of the city, which is where, in fact, it's there in verse 10. This is where deals are done, where justice is carried out, business is transacted. And he goes and says he wants this cave in the field. And there's a little bit of Middle Eastern bargaining going on here out of respect and a little bit of exaggeration and so on. So Ephron says, no, my lord, verse 11, hear me, I give you the field. I give you the field and the cave that is in it. And Abraham says, no. I want to do a deal with you. I'll give you the price of the field. And so Ephron says, well, here's the price, 400 shekels of silver. But what's that between you and me? What's 400 shekels of silver between friends? And he's not saying have it for nothing. He's simply saying that's the price. It's a polite way of saying that's how much the field and the land is worth. And interestingly here, and I'm guessing here, and it's not the most important part of this, I think Ephron was setting the bar really high, as would normally be the case, and then he'd expect Abraham to come in somewhere halfway, and then they'd meet in the middle somewhere. But Abraham doesn't haggle with Ephron. I suspect that Ephron couldn't believe his luck, quite frankly, but nonetheless, Abraham pays the full amount that Ephron mentions at first deal. And here's a really historic moment, because now, for the very first time in all the decades they've lived in the Promised Land, they own part of the Promised Land. They own a field, and they own a cave there. And in that cave, at a later date, Abraham is going to be buried. Isaac, Rebekah, Leah, Jacob, they're all going to be buried in that cave. And here's the first part of the land literally owned, legally owned by Abraham and his family. But notice too the testimony that Abraham has with this people. Come back to verse 6. When Abraham says he wants to buy this land, the Hittites answered Abraham, "Hear us, my Lord, you are a prince of God among us." You are a prince of God among us. So isn't that a great testimony from pagan people? These are not believers. These are Hittites, the part of the Canaanites. But there's something about Abraham's testimony over so many years, walking with integrity and uprightness before the people, that they recognize him as a prince with God. Here's something else I think we learn from this story. Even though Sarah has died, and I believe Abraham believes somewhat in the resurrection of the dead, for example, Abraham still shows respect for her dead body. He wants it given a proper burial. And I believe that's a good biblical and scripture warrant, that even the body of a deceased believer should be dealt with a certain amount of respect. And it's the pattern for God's people all the way through the Bible. And what they did in Abraham's day, they would have washed the body, they would have wrapped it in clean cloth, they would have put spices in it, as you remember they were doing with the body of Jesus after his crucifixion, and then they would place it in the ground or in a tomb. And of course, they were doing that all the time, to use, if you like, New Testament age words, in the sure and certain hope of the resurrection from the dead. But they treated the deceased body with respect because it was God's gift to that person for their life. Warren Wiersbe has a lovely quote here. Warren Wiersbe is a great man for quotes and little sound bites. It's worth, when you find them, file them away. They'll come in handy one day. And he says, Genesis ends with a full tomb, but the four Gospels end with an empty tomb. Jesus has conquered death and taken away its sting. So because of his victory, we need not fear death or the grave. And isn't that a great truth? The story here is of a full tomb. And by the time you get to Genesis, it is full, the end of Genesis. But the Gospels end with an empty tomb because he is risen. He is not among the living, he is with the dead in that sense. So here's a remarkable, important moment in the story of the lessons of faith with so much to learn from. But let's go just briefly to the beginning of chapter 25 and put Abraham's passing alongside Sarah's. Many Christians, even though I think they've read Genesis, maybe not as carefully as they might, are quite surprised when they discover that Abraham married again. Remember, he's an old man at this particular point. In the middle, in chapter 24, Isaac gets married. And Abraham, when Isaac gets married, Abraham is still going to be alive for another 35 years or so, during which time he marries this woman Keturah, about whom we know absolutely nothing. She's described here as another wife, but down in verse 6, I believe she's included in verse 6 to the sons of his concubines, and she's also called that in, I think it's in First Chronicles. And I think the reason for that is not to be contradictory. I think the reason there is, if you like, to preserve the special standing of Sarah. Although he married Keturah after Sarah's death, but I think that's the reason here. It's just to preserve the special standing of Sarah in Abraham's life. And by Keturah, Abraham, now as a very old man, fathers 6 more sons. So further fulfilling the promise, remember, that he would become the father of many nations. And so we're given these names here. And it's not possible to trace with accuracy much about these descendants of Abraham. But the one that does stand out there particularly would be the name of Midian. And the Midianites at various stages in the Old Testament often allied with various other tribal groupings and became part of the wider Canaanite tribal clans that actually were a real thorn in the flesh to the Israelites later on, although they were distantly related in this particular sense. And Abraham is also making plans for his own departure. He's tidying up the affairs, and he wants to do that in a way that honors and respects all his children, but has particular regard for Isaac, who is, of course, the child of promise. So he oversees the distribution of gifts to Ishmael and his descendants and to Keturah's sons. But the bulk, of course, is reserved for Isaac. And it's interesting in verse 9 that Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, which suggests possibly, I don't want to overread this, but possibly that Isaac and Ishmael were somewhat reconciled later on in life. Maybe they were just going through the motions out of respect to their father, but I don't particularly know. And it also, obviously, Ishmael, for a period at least, returned to Hebron to take care of his father's affairs. And then Abraham not only protects Isaac's inheritance financially, but he also does so by sending his other sons away to the east. And that's why it appears that Ishmael's descendants and Keturah's sons all gradually merge to become the various Arabic peoples as we know them today. But the last thing I want you to notice here is the phrase that's used about Abraham's death in verse 8. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. There's so much in that verse on its own, isn't there? He breathed his last, he died in a good old age, and nobody would doubt that 175 was a good old age. And even in those days, that was a good old age. Remember, the numbers have dropped considerably from the early days of Genesis. An old man and full of years. And the Hebrew scholars say that means more than just many years to his credit. He lived them to the full. He was full of years. He didn't just go through life. He lived life, as we would say today, to the full. His life was full of years, and he was gathered to his people. Now, there's two views on that phrase, and I'm just going to share them with you, and you can, if you like, take your pick, because I don't think there's a huge importance one way or the other. One writer says the phrase is constantly distinguished from departing this life and being buried, and denotes the reunion in death with friends who've gone before, and therefore presupposes faith in the personal continuance of a man after death. So some writers see this as a clear statement of a belief in a life after death, that there was some relationship existing between people after death. Other writers see this as purely as a way of saying he died. It doesn't say he sometimes in the Old Testament the word Sheol is used, for example, and it can mean death or the grave, simply where every human being goes, or it sometimes can be used of hell. But it doesn't need to mean hell. And depends which version you've got here, whether it says Sheol or not. But the point I'm just trying to make here is that I don't think there's any doubt in my own mind that Abraham had some understanding that beyond this life, there was another life. This life was not all there was. And so one of the reasons he lived a full life, full of years, was he lived in obedience to God, looking forward, remember, to the promise. Remember what Hebrews 11 tells us. Looking for the city without foundations, whose designer and builder is God. That's what Abraham was living for. And it reminds me of that great line of that great powerful hymn. But Lord, 'tis for thee, for thy coming we wait. The sky, not the grave, is our goal. And ever before, I believe that ever before Abraham's body was laid in the grave, he was already in glory with his Lord, as was Sarah, 35 or so years previously. That's a great thought, isn't it? When we bury the remains of our loved ones in the ground or commit them to the fire, it's only the outward vehicle. The person themselves is actually, if they're believers, already in the presence of the Lord.